chemistry, I learned that
Uh-huh.
you have to be precise and exact. If you're measuring a chemical, it has to be exactly that amount.
Well, no, 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 no. I'm not necessarily talking. I'm talking about conclusions. I'm not necessarily talking about the physical chemistry, and we're getting into a specific class here. I'm talking about any science experiment. Yes, if you lie, well, you could put the right chemicals in, but you could still lie on paper and pencil.
Of course.
You could come up with a report.
That's what you're talking about, the
Okay.
morality. Morality is going to tell you to have the correct conclusion.
Well, but they won't know if you lie. You can lie. Many scientists do lie, whether to get a grant, whether to manipulate somebody's thinking. Some scientists lie because they want some recognition. So you do need morality when you're going into a science experiment. So let's just look at it from this perspective. Not only do you need physical things, but you need these immaterial things like logic, reason, science, math, and morality. Now, here's my question. If those things were all different than somebody else's science, logic, reason, and morality, would we all conclude the same thing?
No, we wouldn't, but...
Okay, so how do we know anything for sure then?
Well,
how do we know anything for sure?
Then you could turn around and say, well, my results...
If lying is subjective, what if somebody lies and then the person says, I don't feel like I did lie. I feel like I just manipulated things a little bit to make it more interesting, and I think that's okay. Look, we would not know what the answers were. In other words, we don't live that kind of life, do we? If a scientist lies on a science experiment, he's going to get caught and someone's going to bust him. But if we just come from evolution, why should anybody care about whether or not lying is objective or subjective? There's no purpose behind it. Who cares? Let him lie on a science experiment. Let him lie about his life. We don't care. He wants grant money. That's just his DNA. His DNA constructed him to be a liar. And you know what? Lying doesn't really exist. It's really just indifference. So really what you're seeing is indifference.
Well, what I can tell you is that based upon the results or the numbers that a student is using, okay, he may lose only a couple of points at the end of the experiment because the numbers are wrong. But if his work and his step-by-step analysis,
his logic was right,
and logic is correct, then he got the right answer for the numbers that he was using. Okay.
But that's honesty. You guys. I'm not talking about honesty. I'm talking about dishonesty. How do you know what dishonesty is? What does that mean? Who says it's dishonesty? What you call dishonesty may be honesty to somebody else. I'm saying we don't live in that kind of world, but it still begs the question, if it's not part of our world, if our world is one that consists of objective morality, in other words, this is right and this is wrong, I don't care what atheist out there says there's no purpose to the universe. If Richard Dawkins ever got his home stolen, all of his books burned up, and his family got murdered, he's going to do the same thing and say the same thing that anybody else in the world would do. Whether you're in a remote opposite tribe in Africa, or if you're somebody that lives in the urban streets of Los Angeles, you are going to do the same thing. You're going to have a sense of self-worth. You're going to have a sense of morality. You're going to have a sense of right and wrong. You're going to have a sense of judgment. You're going to have a sense of journalism, editing, thinking, thought, reasoning, math, morality of every right kind, because we don't base people's responses on these things with just saying it. We will see the truth come out when those things actually happen. If a scientist was an atheist and he lied on a science experiment.
Well, many scientists
He's going to be
are.
busted. Well, I don't care if his experiment is right or wrong. Of course it's going to be right or wrong because he lied. But he can easily say, well, this is my truth, just like they're doing with the Common Core curriculum, by the way. But that's besides the point. I'm just making the point that there is an objectiveness to the world. The question becomes, where does this objectiveness come from? You guys don't have a problem with objectiveness. I could tell that. If you guys probably pay your bills. You guys probably pay your rent. You love your wives. You love your children. You bless people. You want to do good to those who you love. And that's because you're made in God's image. That has nothing to do with evolution. Does that make sense? Evolution is just a chemical changing process. It has nothing at all to do with morality. So where does morality come from? If you're feeling it and it's objective and it's the same for everyone everywhere at all times, where in the world does it come from, you guys?
Well, first thing, it's not the same for everybody.
Sure it is.
You think,
Sure it is. Now they may not. They may deny it, and that's what Romans 1:18 through 20 says. They suppress the truth and unrighteousness, but every person knows what's good and bad. If you look at, for instance, it's the death of the end of the spear. I can't remember the missionary story. It's about tribes, a missionary going to help the tribes proclaim the gospel to them, but they were having a real problem. They were going from tribe to tribe, stabbing people because one person thought one guy raped their daughter and the whole tribe is after another. Well, those women and children cried. Those men cried because they lost their families. I don't care how tribal and how primitive you may be. You still have a sense of right and wrong. They felt the same right and wrong when their families got murdered by another tribe. And what did they do? They had a sense of judgment. They took their spears, sharpened their spears, and went and killed their tribe. So you have this brutal act going back and forth to primitive people, which up until the 1950s had no idea what a white person looked like. And here they are stabbing each other. These are primitive people that live in the remotest parts of the Amazon jungle. And here they are having a sense of morality, right and wrong. And there's a lot of people out there who suppress it. You're absolutely right, Felix.
Well,
there's a lot of people suppress that truth.
Yeah, but that would be innate, which is what I said originally. When you
Say it again?
It would be innate. It's
What's
already inside. You know, you don't know where it came from, but it's in you. Okay.
Okay, but what does that mean? But that doesn't tell me anything. Evolution tells me that. Evolution tells me how I ought to behave, Mark?
No.
Okay, then where does it come from?
Well, I know what the answer you're looking for. The answer is it would come from God.
I want to know what answer you think. I don't care about me. I only care about you guys. Where does morality and the sense of logic and reason come from?
I don't have an issue with that. I readily admit that it comes from God. Because
then you would fall on your face before a holy God and you would repent.
My parents.
You need to know which God it is, Mark. Mark, you got to know what God it is.
Well, you're right. I wouldn't know. I would assume it would be not Shiva, okay, or one of those Indian gods.
Medusa? Wouldn't be Medusa.
No.
I used to know Medusa. She's a pretty good-looking girl.
Oh, you could look at her.
Yeah, she's pretty aggressive. She's
really.
You wouldn't want to make babies with her, man. She'll probably eat you alive.
The bottom line is, I readily admit I learned about good and bad, about morality from my parents, who learned it from their parents.
Okay.
But
Mark, that doesn't tell me anything of where it comes from. So did my parents. My parents taught me what's right and wrong.
And they're not.
My parents taught me what was right and wrong.
And they're Catholic.
Doesn't mean it comes from our parents.
They're Catholic. They're not born again.
Well, it
But
doesn't
in this
matter
sense,
because God's written these laws on our heart. My point is
right,
that
in
it
this,
comes from within us
it
because
comes from
God
within,
has put it there.
exactly.
You guys need to admit that that's where it comes from. Do you have any problem with that?
I told you I didn't.
We don't. We're not arguing
Okay.
about that.
So,
I never argued
all
about
right.
that. That's why.
So then
that's why when I
evolution
said
really
to
should
my,
not come up then.
when I said to my assistant principal, when he said, "Whose morality are you teaching?" Okay,
Uh-huh.
I told him that I was basing my morality on what I learned about, good and evil. Now, you have to understand something. I taught African American kids. All right.
Okay.
I used to teach my kids in school when we used to talk family. They used to laugh because I would say, "Now listen to me."
Where was,
So
by
that
the way,
way-
where was Hitler's morality?
Why don't you let me finish?
I'm sorry, just listen.
I would
Go
tell
ahead.
them. I would tell them.
I'd love to answer that, by the way, Felix.
I would tell them that you know I'm a parent as well as a teacher, and if I talk about family, I said, well, when you get married and have children, and I reiterated that again. I said, when you get married and have children, not the other way around, as is the case many times in today's society. They see people having children and then they get married, or they decide not to get married. But I said,
Mm-hmm.
and that comes from the fact that back during slavery, the slaves weren't allowed to get married, so they
Okay.
would, according to the terminology of today, they would hook up, and it would be like they were married and have children, but they weren't married, okay? Because the slave owners did not want the slaves to have a sense of family, because they were considered property. They weren't considered human beings, okay? So my assistant principal was worried that I was, going against the teachings, because what happens is, a lot of, not a lot, but some of the kids, when they got into high school, found themselves getting pregnant, and they weren't married, and they would take the baby to term, okay? And what happens is the grandparents wound up raising the kid, because, the kid wasn't old enough to really be a parent. Getting pregnant is biological. It doesn't make you a parent, okay?
Okay.
Parenting is something that you have to work at and learn. And unfortunately,
Yeah.
so
It comes from a moral source, right?
right. And that's what I was trying to instill
So-
in my students. That's all.
Okay. Well, that's great. But see, but every time that you say that, Mark, every time that you and Felix talk about this, I keep hearing that, and you're absolutely right. But I never hear you say, look, the source comes from God. I don't necessarily know how it comes from God, but it comes from God, from His Word, from His very
That's
being.
not
We are
true.
made in His image.
That's not true. We have said that. I've said that to you. I read.
But I want to
read
be
you.
sure that you know the right God, because it sounds like to me you're confused which God it is, and you're not even sure if we were evolved,
No, I am
if God
talking-
created the universe, if evolution took place.
I am talking about, in my case, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Moses.
Okay.
Okay.
So did
And
evolution
if
take
you were
place?
if you were talking about God, you would be talking about the same God. The only difference is you would be adding Jesus as the Son of God. Okay.
That's right.
So basically, with the
Hey, Mark,
what?
do you believe in evolution?
Yes, I do. I still.
Okay. Where does God mix? Then where does God come from in that? Show me. Could you just explain to me how you marry God and evolution together?
Honestly, it's a confusing point.
Okay, but do you know? Do you know, Mark? Do you know how to mix them together?
That if there was a prime mover as we said originally, the prime mover was
Okay.